There are issues of Noteworthy on your table. The theme of Noteworthy, which is a Denver Foundation newsletter, is combating hunger. And there are some very specific suggestions on what you can do. On some of the tables, there is a letter of sort of information, a challenge letter from a Rotarian, Frank Sargent, former PDG, who also talks about how you can get involved. And it speaks significantly about how you can raise the issue in your community with elected officials, school board members, your faith community. Other ways, you can sponsor a summer food site. You can learn more about hunger and keep in touch with it through the Colorado Coalition to End Hunger website and in other ways. But I really want to defer to Kevin, who is a friend and colleague on the front lines, to kind of get us in touch with the problem in a much more direct way. Kevin?
I have to be on my best behavior because one of my board members sits on my right here. So what I talk about frequently isn't fun. It's often painful, and it's always sad. And I'm gonna rattle some statistics off at you. But before I do that, I want to tell you a story about somebody that receives food at an emergency food pantry out on the west side of our city. I think it's in Lakewood, Wheat Ridge. I'm not sure what the area was. But I met David this past April when we were doing a hunger study, trying to identify exactly how folks end up at food pantries, what were the situations that got them there. And many times when I call on corporations and seek funding, they'll make an offhanded comment, well, really we're just talking about homeless, aren't we? Or really we're just talking about people that don't want to work, aren't we? Or really we're talking about people that just don't care, aren't we? And nothing could be further from the truth. So David tells me his story. David's an electrician. He's 43 years old. He has a wife of 21 years. He has 2 children. One was 16 and one was 8. And David worked for an electrician in the Idaho Springs area for about 25 years. Actually, right out of his apprenticeship, his tech school, worked with this gentleman. The gentleman in Idaho Springs decided to close up his business. And he said, I'm done, I'm retiring. He was 62 years old. David wasn't in a position to buy him out. The market, as we might have expected in late 2007 and early 2008, was down up in the mountains. So David moved his family down to West Denver and tried to get a job as an electrician and worked for a little while, worked some odd jobs with some housing contractors. He primarily does residential. And then, of course, we all know what happened with the residential market, housing market in late 2008 and certainly all through 2009. So David found himself without a job. David's wife, Sarah, was a beautician. She cut hair at a beauty shop up in Idaho Springs. Came down to Denver with her husband, obviously, and their family. Tried to find work as a beautician. Found a little bit of work once in a while. Got laid off in early 2009. So David's at a food pantry picking up food, and I'm talking with David. And he's explaining the story to me, and I'm just kind of thinking, gosh, this shouldn't be. And David said, well, we had a little money saved away. We were fairly frugal. We had a little money stashed away in a savings account. But things got really tough, and I had to stop paying my health insurance because I couldn't afford the COBRA anymore. So he stops the health insurance. 2 months later, Sarah gets breast cancer. So Sarah gets breast cancer. They deplete their savings. They lose their house. They're living in a 2-bedroom apartment. And David and his family are accessing food from a food pantry about once a month. And David said it's just enough to kind of tide us over and wait till the unemployment check comes in. He still does some wildcatting and works where he can. His wife is recovering from breast cancer. But here's a guy, and here's a family that did everything right. Did it the American way, if you will. And they find themselves at a food pantry seeking emergency food assistance. So statistics be damned. That's more realistic and more apt what you're apt to see. You're likely to see in our community with those seeking food assistance. We're not talking about famine like we're talking about in third world countries. We're talking about food insecurity, which is the uncertainty of knowing where or when your next nutritious meal is coming from. And the most recent statistics that are available from the government say that 1 in every 9 Americans is food insecure in this country. Now just let that sink in for a minute. It's a staggering number. I think our population is estimated to be nearly 310 million. It's a staggering number. In October of 2009, 38 million Americans accessed food stamps, now called the SNAP program or Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. 38 million Americans accessed food stamps in the month of October. 1 in 8 Americans accessed food stamps in our country. 5 years ago, that number was 1 in 12 Americans, and 10 years ago, that number was 1 in 14 Americans. I was listening to the radio on the way in to lunch today, and one economist says the new normal for unemployment, the new normal national average for unemployment could be 7.5% by the time we shake out of this recession. That from about 4.5% before we got into this recession. So 1 in 8 Americans, that's the highest number of Americans that have ever accessed food stamps since food stamps became a national program in, I believe it was 1978 or 1979. In Colorado, 375,000 of our neighbors have accessed food stamps in Colorado. That's a 36% increase from October 09 to October 08, and about 100,000 more people on food stamp benefits. Now, if that sounds staggering to you, consider that only 55% of those eligible in Colorado are accessing food stamps, SNAP benefits. So 45% of those that are even eligible, and before anybody is out there thinking, well, gosh, they might be illegal, only U.S. citizens and those that are legally in the country can access food stamps. So 375,000 Coloradans accessing food stamps. And again, as Jeff said, that's 49th in the country, our participation rate. From an economic standpoint, there's tremendous benefit for our retail community. There's jobs created when the federal benefits, and the federal government picks up 100% of the cost of the food stamp benefits. The state picks up some administrative fees for that, but the federal government picks up 100% of that cost. For every 10% increase in the participation level in our state, if we got our participation level up to 74% or 75%, it's an extra $200 million in economic benefit for our state. And I have to think that Governor Ritter and everybody that's wrestling with a gigantic budget shortfall down in our state capital would look upon that very favorably. From an emergency food standpoint, it's important to remember that what food banks do, what my organization does, and there's actually 4 others in the state of Colorado, we're sister organizations, and unlike a for-profit or a competitive environment, we don't fight. We share everything. We share food. We share logistics. We share transportation. But it's important to remember that food banks are the middleman between donors of food, which come from any source, and the emergency food pantries, shelters, on-site feeding programs that are throughout our city. Nationally, the food banks that halo underneath the Feeding America banner, that's kind of the national organization that, I guess for a lack of a better term, regulates food banking, 2.83 billion pounds were distributed via the emergency food system in 2009. 2.83 billion pounds. If the trend of the last 6 months of 2009 continues, that number will be in excess of 3.4 billion pounds in 2010. Incredible number of pounds. If you want to equate that to meals, the thrifty meal plan under the USDA is approximately 1.28 pounds per meal. The last time I had 1.28 pounds per meal, I was 16 years old, I'm sure. But that's the federal kind of standard. That equates to, that 2.83 billion pounds equates to 2.2 billion meals that flowed through the emergency food system to those in need in our country in 2009. In Colorado, the 5 of us, the 5 food banks, we distributed 60 million pounds through the emergency food system in 2009. We touch each of Colorado's 64 counties on usually either a weekly or a bi-weekly or certainly a monthly basis. If the trend of the last 6 months continues in 2010, we will exceed 70 or 71 million pounds of food distributed, again, via our emergency food system in 2010. And again, if you want to break down the 60 million pounds of food, that's roughly 47.5 million meals that again flowed through the emergency food system. Just at our organization at Food Bank of the Rockies, we service 29 counties in the northern part of Colorado. If you kind of drew a line from Monument to both borders, all the way up and through the state of Wyoming, with the exceptions of Weld, Larimer, and Boulder-Broomfield, those are sister food banks of ours. We distribute